believe you're a good person. Most of us do. You pay your bills. You don't hurt people. You follow the rules. You nod at the right moments. Smile politely. Say thank you, even when you're breaking inside. You keep the chaos neatly tucked away, because that's what good people do. But pause. What if that sense of goodness you carry isn't truly yours? What if it was installed in you, not chosen by you? Line by line, like code written into a machine. From the moment you could speak, you were taught what was right and what was wrong. Not by philosophers, not through introspection, but by systems, institutions, by caretakers repeating what was handed to them, by cultures wired for control, not consciousness. You were trained through repetition and reward, praise when you conformed, silence or punishment when you strayed. And slowly, without even knowing, their voices became your inner voice. I shouldn't feel this. I must do that. I have to be this kind of person. Not because you thought deeply about it, but because you were told it was good. And goodness, after all, is the golden ticket to belonging. Carl Jung called this the persona, the mask you create to be accepted. It's not fake, but it's not the whole truth either. It's a version of you edited for social survival, a performance learned through watching others, through absorbing scripts handed down like sacred doctrine. And here's the dilemma. Underneath that mask, underneath all the obedience and self-control, there's something unruly, the real you. And sometimes, that real you doesn't agree with the program. Sometimes it wants to scream in quiet rooms. Sometimes it resents what you're supposed to be grateful for. Sometimes it hungers for what you're not allowed to want. Envy, rage, lust, resentment. These aren't flaws. They're signals. Raw data from the psyche, pointing towards something buried. But when they rise, you panic. You shame yourself. You hide. Because the program says, good people don't feel this way. And that's where the suffering begins. You confuse repression with morality. You think self-denial is virtue. You carry guilt, not for what you've done, but for what you feel. But what if those emotions weren't evidence of your badness? What if they were proof of your aliveness, of your complexity, of your freedom from the script? What if the real moral work isn't in suppressing the shadow, but in understanding it? Not in performing goodness, but in asking, with honesty, whose definition of good am I living by? Because before you can be truly good, you must first be real. And being real means feeling what you feel, even when it doesn't fit the mask. Morality feels personal. It feels like something you own, like a compass that lives in your chest. You say, I believe in kindness. I value honesty. I would never do that. But pause for a moment. Where did those beliefs come from? Because most of what you call your values were your zero, or ger, or os chosen. They were inherited, installed, absorbed, long before you had the tools to question them. Children don't sit around debating Kant versus utilitarianism. They absorb. They learn through the tone, reward, punishment, and silence. When you were praised for being polite, you didn't understand social nuance. You understood this. Compliance equals love. Obedience equals safety. When you were scolded for being too much, for questioning, crying, or speaking up, your nervous system didn't label it as social conditioning. It stored it as truth. And from that point forward, your body kept the score. You didn't become more ethical. You became more controlled. You didn't become wiser. You became more afraid of stepping out of line. Because early morality isn't taught with reflection, it's taught with repetition. And what repetition breeds becomes identity. So as adults, we move through life believing we're making ethical choices. But often, we're just repeating patterns, following scripts, avoiding shame. This is the illusion of morality, that it's deliberate, that we weigh options, that we think for ourselves. But more often than not, we react, then we justify. We dress up our conditioning in the language of virtue. Michel Foucault called this the internalized gaze, the idea that the external judge no longer needs to exist, because we've swallowed the judge whole. You police yourself. You judge your thoughts before they become words. You shrink your desires before they reach expression, not because someone told you to, but because someone once did. And now you do it for them. And here's where it gets dangerous. When you mistake programming for character, you begin to project it onto others. You assume your standard is universal, that what you've learned is the truth, rather than just a truth. And now you're not just judging yourself, you're judging the world through a lens you didn't even choose. This is where righteousness is born. This is where moral rigidity becomes weaponized. You shame those who live differently. You distance yourself from those who don't conform. And all the while, you believe you're being good. But are you? Because the real question morality should begin with isn't, how do I look to others? It's, where did this belief come from? Who taught me to think this way? Is this mine, or merely familiar? Without that reflection, morality becomes mimicry. Without that pause, goodness becomes performance. And what gets lost in that performance is empathy. Because when you're busy proving you're good, you forget to be human. Moral programming doesn't unite us. It divides. Not because morality itself is flawed, but because most of us never examine where our sense of right and wrong actually came from. Once your idea of goodness is shaped by someone else's template, anyone outside that template becomes a threat. Not intentionally, not consciously, but deep in the wiring of your identity. You see it in politics. You see it in religion. You see it in the online mobs that attack with the full force of certainty, but without an ounce of reflection. People clinging to a moral identity they didn't consciously choose, using it as a weapon instead of a compass. Not because they're evil, but because they think they're good. That's the paradox of unconscious morality. It feels noble. It sounds virtuous, but it's hollow. It's driven not by inner clarity, but by tribal belonging. We stop asking, is this ethical? Is this kind? Is this true? And we start asking, does this align with my group? Will this keep me accepted? Is this how people like me are supposed to think? What we call morality often becomes a social badge, a costume, a tool for inclusion or exclusion. It's how we end up in echo chambers, mistaking consensus for truth. It's how we justify cruelty in the name of justice, shaming others with the full conviction of the righteous. Carl Jung warned us, the more unconscious your beliefs, the more dangerous they become. Because unexamined beliefs aren't just lazy. They're lethal. They don't evolve. They don't adapt. They harden. And when a belief hardens without reflection, it becomes dogma. And dogma doesn't think. It defends. It punishes. It divides. You weren't born to think critically about your moral framework. You were born to survive. And for most of history, survival meant one thing: loyalty to the tribe. To question the tribe was to risk exile. To challenge the script was to invite danger. So we learned to suppress the voice of doubt and call it loyalty. But today, the tribe might be the very thing holding you back. The family, the culture, the ideology might be the shell you've outgrown. So what happens when the values you were raised with no longer feel like your own? You pause. You listen. Not to the voices that taught you, but to the one you buried beneath obedience. And slowly, something radical begins to happen. You start to question not just others, but yourself. You start to see that being good is not a performance. It's a practice. It's not inherited. It's earned. Not by following rules, but by becoming aware of the ones that shaped you. That's where a new morality begins. Not in outrage, not in conformity, but in curiosity. It begins the moment you stop defending what you were taught and start asking why you believe it. And maybe, just maybe, what you find underneath the programming is something more human than perfect, something messier, but also something more real. Unlearning morality isn't the same as becoming immoral. It's the beginning of moral ownership. But let's be honest, this process doesn't feel empowering at first. It feels destabilizing. Because when you begin to peel away the layers of inherited beliefs, you're not just questioning your values, you're questioning your identity. You were told what's right since you were old enough to speak, be nice, share, obey, smile. And when you start to challenge those rules, not with rebellion, but with reflection, a strange feeling creeps in. Guilt, as if you're betraying something sacred, as if asking why means you're doing something wrong. But what if that guilt isn't a sign of wrongdoing, but a sign of awakening? Because guilt in this context isn't proof of immorality. It's the residue of programming. It's your nervous system reacting to a script that no longer fits. It's the internalized gaze pushing back, asking you to conform. Not because it's true, but because it's familiar. But the truth is, true integrity doesn't arise from obedience. It arises from conscious alignment, from acting not out of fear of punishment or desire for praise, but from inner clarity. You stop asking, "What should I do?" and start asking, "What feels true?" That question can't be answered by a handbook. It can't be reduced to doctrine. Because real morality isn't rigid. It's responsive. It breathes. It grows with you. Carl Jung believed that the mature individual is not someone who blindly follows the rules, but someone who can hold tension. Tension between right and wrong, self and other, light and shadow. Someone who can say, "I don't know," and mean it. Someone who can pause in the gray, rather than rush to the black or white. And when you begin this work, this slow, sometimes lonely deconstruction, something profound happens. You stop needing to prove your goodness. Because goodness stops being an identity you wear. It becomes a practice you live. You show up differently, with curiosity instead of certainty, with humility instead of righteousness. You begin to notice when your judgments are more about your conditioning than about truth. You stop measuring morality by social approval and start feeling into context, timing, nuance, and intention. You start asking, does this action expand connection or diminish it? Is this choice rooted in fear or in presence? Am I reacting from an old wound or responding from awareness? That doesn't make morality relative. It makes it relational, human, alive. Because morality that never bends eventually breaks. But morality that adapts with wisdom becomes a compass, not a cage. And maybe that's the point. Not to arrive at some fixed sense of being good, but to stay awake in every moment to what being good might actually require. Not obedience, but presence. Not performance, but participation. Unchecked moral programming doesn't just shape your values. It shapes your blind spots. It trains you not only in what to think, but in what not to question. Not because you're weak, not because you lack intelligence, but because obedience was sold to you as virtue. From a young age, you were praised not for inquiry, but for compliance, not for discomfort, but for politeness, not for curiosity, but for being good. But here's the danger. When morality is inherited but unexamined, it becomes a silent operating system, governing your actions without your awareness. And history is full of tragedies, authored not by monsters, but by good citizens. People who followed orders, people who upheld laws, people who believed that they were doing the right thing because they never questioned who wrote the rules. That's the truly terrifying part. We like to think evil wears a mask, that we'd recognize it, that it would feel wrong. But evil often comes dressed in virtue. It speaks in the language of duty. It hides behind the greater good. From religious inquisitions to political purges to cultural genocides, the most devastating acts have been committed not by the obviously cruel, but by the unquestionably certain. And that's the dark side of moral programming. It doesn't just shape behavior, it shapes identity. So deeply that people begin to conflate obedience with goodness and defiance with immorality. Hannah Arendt called this the banality of evil. She didn't mean evil was boring. She meant it was ordinary, hidden in bureaucracy, wrapped in procedure, executed by people who looked in the mirror and saw someone righteous. They didn't cackle like villains. They didn't feel like monsters. They were simply doing their job, following the rules, obeying the script. Carl Jung, with his usual precision, took it further. The greatest danger to civilization is not the evil man, but the man who thinks he is good. Because when you're certain of your goodness, you stop looking, you stop questioning, you stop listening. And anyone who disagrees becomes not just wrong, but dangerous. Empathy dies in the echo chamber of righteousness. That's why questioning your own moral reflexes isn't self-doubt. It's self-awareness. It's responsibility. It's asking, where did this belief come from? Who benefits from me holding it? Does it reflect truth or simply conditioning? When you start pulling on those threads, the entire fabric of inherited morality begins to shift. And that's uncomfortable. Because it means acknowledging that not all your convictions are conscious. That maybe, just maybe, you've worn the label of good, not as a truth, but as a performance. This doesn't mean discarding your ethics. It means reclaiming them. It means distinguishing between conscience and conditioning, between inner truth and outer pressure. This is where liberation begins, not in rebellion for its own sake, not in burning down every belief, but in the quiet courage to ask, is this truly mine? Because until you ask that, your morality isn't integrity, it's programming. So what does real morality look like? It's not the morality printed on posters or programmed into your upbringing. It's not the one handed to you by schools, religions, or governments. It's not the one that rewards you for compliance and punishes you for deviation. Real morality begins where imitation ends. It's not a performance. It's not loud. It doesn't live in speeches, slogans, or the curated pages of your social life. It lives in the quiet space between what you feel and what you choose. When no one's watching, when nothing is at stake, except your own integrity. It's the quiet decision to say no when every voice around you says yes. To not follow the crowd. To not humiliate when you have power. To not hate when you've withdrawn binon. By Singdorf. Winten Trolling non. In Balbarvan been invited to not justify cruelty just because it wears the mask of righteousness, because morality isn't inherited. It's built, slowly, painfully, brick by brick, through doubt, failure, introspection, contradiction. And that journey almost always begins in solitude. Not isolation, but solitude. The space where external noise fades and your own voice, your real voice, emerges. At first it's shaky, small, confused. But with time, it gets clearer, sharper, firmer. Not because you've memorized rules, but because you've confronted yourself. And that's the turning point. When you stop living by programming and start living by principle. When your choices aren't dictated by fear or reward, but by clarity, by conscience. Socrates once said, "An unexamined life is not worth living." But perhaps what he truly meant was, an unexamined morality is dangerous. Because when you've never questioned where your values came from, you don't see when they've been hijacked. By ideology, by nationalism, by fear, by the quiet desperation to belong. And here lies the terrifying irony. The greatest evils in history were often carried out by people who believed they were doing good. People who followed orders, who blended in, who silenced their doubt, ignored their inner voice, and surrendered their morality to the group. Because what we call goodness can be weaponized, turned into blind obedience, turned into self-righteous cruelty, turned into systems that punish anything outside the mold. So the question isn't, are you a good person? The question is deeper. Have you actually chosen who you are? Or are you simply playing the role you were taught to play? Because when goodness becomes a mask, it's only a matter of time before that mask turns into a monster. And the ones who never ask where their morality came from, they're the ones who wake up one day, doing things they swore they'd never do. Not because they were evil, but because they never stopped to wonder, is the goodness I'm clinging to already turning into something else?